Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the seminar Limits to Growth plus 50. Can our economies keep growing indefinitely on a finite planet? 50 years ago, the Club of Rome wrote the report, The Limits to Growth, triggering an earthquake in policy and academia. The questions were raised of whether our economic system, is structurally unsustainable if it's based on perpetual growth. The debate on the thesis on limits is straightforward at its basics. We cannot grow forever in a finite planet. The thesis reached its splendor in the 1970s, but then declined in the 1980s and 90s as new ideas like sustainable development and green growth made the case that the growth economy, can be made compatible with the environment through technological improvements and institutional changes. But over the last decade, the thesis of limits and the questions around limits to growth have re-emerged and have come back to political debates. And the notions like planetary boundaries, donut economics, and degrowth. Today we have 5 distinguished speakers to address this question as United Nations Climate Panel and Biodiversity Panel are calling for urgency and for transformative changes in our economic and financial systems. We will start with a keynote from Professor Jørgen Randers, original author of Limits to Growth report, and Professor Emeritus of Climate Strategy at the Norwegian Business School. And it will be followed by comments from 4 panelists. We have Professor Laila Mehta, professor at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. We have Mr. Espen Barth Eide, Norwegian Minister of Climate and the Environment. Dr. Tone Smith, member of the board of the European Society for Ecological Economics, and Marie Sneve Martinsson, vice president of Rødt, the Norwegian Red Party, and member of the parliament. The Norwegian University of Life Sciences Sustainability Arenas, in collaboration with the Political Ecology Forum and the European and International Societies for Ecological Economics, would like to warmly welcome to this event. And without more introductions, I would like to give the floor to Jørgen Randers. Jørgen Randers is Professor Emeritus of Climate Change, of Climate Strategy at the Norwegian Business School. His field is the global future, especially regarding issues on climate, energy, and sustainability. He has spent 1/3 of his life in academia, 1/3 in business, and 1/3 in NGO. He has been president of the Norwegian Business School between 1988 and 1989, and it has been a deputy director of WWF and participated in numerous corporate boards. Professor Randers has written many papers and books, starting with co-authoring The Limits to Growth in 1972. And recent writings of him include 2052, A Global Forecast of the Next 40 Years, and Transformation is Feasible with Johan Rockström and others. Professor Randers, we're honored to have you here. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for those kind words. And I'm really impressed by seeing this number of people up at 9 o'clock in the morning to listen to this type of discussion. I am actually quite grateful for this opportunity to reflect on the fact that it's now 50 years ago that I first gave this talk. Yeah, 50 years. So I must have started talking about the limits to growth 1,000 times, something like this, all over the world, in all types of settings. And still, I prepare the last 5 minutes before I do, because we have tried now for 50 years to communicate a very, very, very simple message. and we have failed. I'm now 77 years old. I've given thousands of the talks where we're simply trying to say that if you are on a finite, small golf ball hanging in space, you cannot have an endless growth in the number of people. Their ecological footprint, that means the resources they use and the pollution they emit. This can't be done in physical terms. Still, 50 years after we said this and thought that this was totally obvious, we still have the endless debate going on whether this is possible, and we have stupid prime ministers that say that if there is the threat of a population decline, it is a threat instead of being something that should be celebrated, by any thinking individual on the surface of the earth, respectless of whether they are gay or women or men or educated or uneducated. If one could make the population decline, this would be the greatest boon to humanity, future generations, and nature. And this is, of course, absolutely unacceptable. And so I start by making this statement just in order to define myself out of the good company, which is where I have been for 50 years. My only great advantage over all of you is that I'm older than all of you. I know more than all of you. Which is and the level of expertise that I have at this point in time compared to at age 27, when I participated in writing The Limits to Growth, is pretty amazing. And particularly because I have, of course, been in this fight for 50 years in all possible arenas. So whenever there is a journalist calling from an international newspaper, and this happens roughly every second day in my life, even at this point in time, the questions asked I have heard a zillion times before, of course, and I know exactly what is the answer. But it is worth continuing the fight, because we're not getting through. Man is behaving largely as stupid at this point in time as 50 years ago. So that's my frame of mind. I have been working for the last 50 years as a doomsayer, the last 20 years, luckily in cooperation with my dear friend Per Espen Stoknes, the climate psychologist. And he says, Jørgen, no one has ever scared anyone into doing anything constructive. So you must smile. So now I'm a depressed man with a smiling face. And I follow Per Espen's dictum that for every 2 pieces of, no, he has it the other way around. So for every 1 piece of bad news, you should add, 2 pieces of good news. And that's the only way to make people listen. In this talk today, I'm going to deviate from that rule. I'm going to, really enjoy, the old truth saying. And at the end, I'll tell you what ought to have been done to solve it. It's very simple to solve the problem. But of course, the solution is unacceptable to the vast majority of human beings, particularly in the Western democracies. Because the solution interferes with, private maximization of welfare in the short term. And of course, voters don't vote for things that add the cost. So let me start in the more proper manner. I'm going to give you a... so where's the clicker? There's the clicker. So this is the book. Got very famous. That's the one thing you can say. And it started the growth debate, and it did not manage to stop the growth debate, by saying that sustainable development is the only solution. The sound man, can I do like this without... Huh? Oh, I see, so I can take it away. Oh, fabulous. Then I can even read or see. Beautiful. I'm doing a structured presentation because otherwise, as you know, I can speak endlessly about anything. So what I'm going to do, that's stupid that the thing is too high, but okay. So I'm going to answer 5 questions, I'm going to answer 5 questions, and then I'm going to make one statement. So first, what did the limits to growth actually say? Secondly, what has happened during the last 50 years? Third, what will happen during the next 50 years? 4, will there be global collapse? Which is, of course, one of the central concepts in all of this. And 5, how can we stop the decline in well-being, which I forecast over the next 50 years? And then, after having presented the solution, I'll conclude and saying that this is difficult, particularly in liberal democratic societies, and it is still doable in principle. So, question number 1, what did the limits to growth say? So 50 years ago, my friends and I wrote this little book. And the little book contained 12 scenarios. Sorry, I should say one other thing. I'm using a number of graphs in this presentation. For those of you who like graphs like the one here, enjoy it. You know, for those who hate graphs, which is 90% of any audience, listen to what I say. You know, I'm not going to point to them or anything. They're just there for those of you who like dynamics of systems and follow things over time. There's always time along the horizontal axis, you know, in these graphs. So the limits to growth contained 12 scenarios for world development from 1970 to the year 2100. 6 of the scenarios of the Limits to Growth book were sad scenarios where something went wrong in the 21st century. Either there was too little food or too little resources or too much pollution or too many people. Something physically went wrong, thereby, you know, making happiness and populations in extreme case decline. So they look like this, the red line, you know, being the population disappearing or at least halving itself, declining in the second half of this century. 6 of the scenarios of the limits to growth were happier scenarios where humanity managed to achieve a certain degree of sustainability in the 21st century. The interesting thing, in 1972, when we published the book, we did not know enough to be able to tell which of the 12 scenarios was the most likely. And actually, science did not know at the time which was the most likely. So the only thing we could do was to make the obvious recommendation that please, mankind, stay away from the collapse scenarios. You know, it's much better to try to shoot through and try to get into some level of sustainability. The concept didn't exist at the time. It was called equilibrium, which makes people hate us, but that's, it's the same idea. Trying to organize one planet living, trying to organize so that everyone has a relatively stable and happy life. So, in order for those that have a hard time following, you know, so this is now the conclusion after the first 5 slides. So this, I've learned that that's a good idea to try to summarize for people what I'm trying to say. So what I'm basically saying is that the limits to growth was, its main message was that it warned against the possibility of overshoot and collapse in the 21st century. It pointed to the fact that it is possible for humanity to increase its numbers and its physical impact, its resource use and its emissions in tons per year to such an extent that you are in non-sustainable territory. And then once you are there, you can't stay there for hundreds of years. So you will be forced down either by the forces of nature or by managed decline. You know, that humanity decides, like the IPCC, that we are now going to try to draw down the annual damage that we're causing to the environment. The interesting thing, and I repeat this because at least for you 50 years later, it ought to be possible to understand that all the controversy between limits and the rest of the world, and particularly the economists, relate to the confusion about my second point there. You know, the limits to growth spoke about the growth in the human footprint, measured in tons per year. This is the resource use, it's the destruction of the forest, it is the emissions of pollutants, etc. It did not talk about value, which is GDP. GDP is dollars per year. The GDP increases when I give very expensive talks in exchange for wonderful paintings. And we can give better and better talks, and we can make wonderfuler and wonderfuler pictures. So GDP growth is totally irrelevant in the discussion of physical growth on a physically finite planet. This message we are not able to get through at all, even at this point in time when I discuss with my other 77-year-old economist friends of the neoliberal type of, or neoclassical macro types, they are unable to understand this difference between the physical reality and the monetized version of this thing. Formerly I thought it was our inability to communicate that was the problem. Now, of course, I understand that we have the standard situation that if your income depends on you not understanding something, you will never understand that. And this goes for most of the people on the surface of the earth who are either in business or are short-term voters that would like, not to have to pay taxes, or if you are a macroeconomist, a professor at the University of Oslo, in the macroeconomics department. Sorry, and now even in my school, I was not the director for 1 year. Actually, I survived 8 years in this position. And now we have the most wonderful, old-fashioned financial economy and macroeconomics department also at my school, teaching the wrong. So that's good. And so I added the third, widely misinterpreted as speaking about growth in GDP. If people had understood what we said, the book would never have become famous. So we are, of course, grateful for the fact that it gave us fame. It didn't, save the world, but we got famous. Then, question number 2. What has happened since? And luckily now there exists scientific literature which has tried to compare developments over the last 50 years with the scenarios of limits. So the most famous one by Gaia Harrington, this wonderful lady at Harvard, she has taken 4 of the scenarios, chosen 4 of the 12. These are the colored graphs. And then she has superposed on this in the white part, which is the part from 1990 onwards. She has superposed the black dots, which is what actually has happened. And I'll show you 5 of these things. So this is for the population. So it says, it's okay. Can you read the top? Although it's half cut, so it says fine. So basically the message is that we wrote the book where the gray stuff basically stops, and then made the scenarios, which are the colored graphs, and then you can afterwards have a look and see what happened to the actual population. And you see the actual population followed the average of our scenarios very exactly. There were 3.5 billion people on the surface of the earth when I gave my first talk. We passed 6 billion as forecast in the year 2000, and we're now at 7.9 billion. So we have more than doubled while I've been speaking and speaking and speaking and speaking, and no one has listened except a few highly educated and women in the rich countries. Actually, quite a few of the because fertility rates are of course coming down like a stone all over the world. So. Fine. So population, yes. What has happened is that the world has followed the limits to growth. Then you do the same thing for industrial output, which was the closest measure to GDP in the model. And you see once more, the black line is essentially following the the history this far. Of course, we still have the more exciting part of the future to the right in the graph, and we haven't gotten there. You do the same thing with pollution. This is emissions. There are two types of emissions here. The one is on plastics waste, and the lower one is on CO2 emissions. And again, you see the general idea that the world has followed the general idea of limits to growth. You take resource use. This is the remaining amount of coal, oil, and gas in the world. It is going down, but we still have a huge amount of coal, oil, and gas. So resource crises are not, a problem at this point in time. And then, interestingly, we even have a welfare index in at least the later editions of the Limits book. And you see how the Human Development Index, in this case, has been growing, just like forecast in the Limits to Growth book. And interestingly, with the stagnation, that's where you finally see some kind of a beginning of a problem in the aggregate data. Conclusion at this point in time is the following: the limits to growth has been surprisingly correct during the first 50 years. The world has overshot. We are in non-sustainable territory. And this is best illustrated by the climate situation, where we are now. So we have increased emissions, to the extent that we're now emitting into the atmosphere twice as much CO2 as is being absorbed every year in the oceans and in the forests of the world. That the remaining half remains in the atmosphere, and as long as we keep doing this, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere goes up, and when the concentration goes up, the temperature goes up. And this is going to continue not only until we stop growing the emissions. We have to draw the emissions all the way down to zero before the concentration levels off. And so we are solidly in overshoot, but we have not yet seen collapse. The world has not collapsed during the last 50 years, at least not a global collapse caused by environmental reasons. So that leads to the next interesting question. What will happen during the next 50 years? So we know what happened during the first 50 years, what happens during the next 50. And this is what I have been working on for the last 10, 15 years. The various books that Erik mentioned are reports written or books written during the last 12 years. I think I've made 4. Talking about what will actually happen when you are so stupid that you don't listen to what Jørgen is saying. That's the general idea. So I don't think people will listen, and consequently it is possible to forecast what will happen. Of course, I don't want this to happen, but this is what I, as a scientist, believe will happen. So we are working now on the 50-year anniversary book. So we're making a new Limits to Growth book, a new computer model. What was interesting about the Limits to Growth was that it was a model-based analysis. So it had a quantitative dynamic model as its core, as something that kept our thinking straight, avoided inconsistencies in the system. So we're now making a new one. And so in September, we will launch the 50-year anniversary book in umpteen countries at the same time as a book model-based. We have been working on this for several years. Here is the new standard run. This is the most likely future, the way I see it. We call it too little too late because it is, of course, a scenario, and it is actually also what we would like to avoid. So we will be happy if we are proven wrong. So what is going to happen? And I'll just talk through some. These are 5 or 6 of the call it 200 variables that exist in the model system. So the model system is very much more complex than this seems to indicate. But then this is already beyond the capacity of most people to absorb. So what is going to happen on the population side? What will happen in our view is that the population is going to continue growing, but it will peak around 2050. So already in 20 years, we will see the population starting to decline. It will not decline because of lack of food or because of pollution. It is going to decline because richer women have fewer children. So the continued GDP expansion is going to, solve the population problem for us. On the GDP side, on the economic activity side, we will see continued growth in value, over this period, but at a slower rate, because it is observed and scientifically provable that the growth rate of economies decline as they get richer. As more and more of the labor force moves from agriculture, manufacturing, construction, into administration, and then into care, the rate of labor productivity growth slows. And this that's what's seen, that the United States grows at 0.5% a year, being the richest thing. Europe, perhaps 1%. China, still at 4 or 5. They were at 10 or 7 in the past when they were really poor. And so this shift is going to happen in the world, which means that the long-term GDP growth rate is going to decline. Still, the GDP per person is going to go up, the blue line. And so people at the end of the century are going to be roughly as rich as half of us. So we are, Norway is, of course, extreme in this case. The third thing I want to point to is the gray line. This is the inequality. So this is the income of the rich divided by the income of the poor. So it's a Palma ratio. And inequality has increased in general over the last 40 years, the left-hand part of the thing, and it is going to continue in the most likely scenario, because of continued liberalization. This is the weakening of the unions and the weakening of the state, the lowering of taxes is what causes inequality to continue to rise in this system. And then the fourth thing I wanted to mention is that energy use will, of course, increase because you have more people and more activity. But we will see the shift from fossil energy towards renewables. And that thing is happening. It is, however, as you can see from the black line, it's not happening fast enough to avoid warming continuing. And in our most likely scenario, we pass +2 degrees centigrade in 2050. So the top Paris goal is violated already in 2050. And in our model system, we peak at around +2.5 degrees centigrade at the end of the century, which is not global collapse, but very, very negative. That means that all the land ice is gone. It means that the sea level is, 90 centimeters, 3 feet higher than it was in the past. It means that there are droughts, and it means that the productive areas are shifted to where people don't live, etc., etc. So it's really sad. It's something that should have been avoided, but in my mind, will not be avoided. My real problem with this is that the coral reefs for snorkelers are already gone, essentially, which is the first real biodiversity catastrophe. And more will come, but we don't think this is going to lead to a total global collapse. For those of you who love curves, I'll just show you what I just spoke about look like, but you're not. So you can then go into the population sector, and you can see the blue line, which is the decline in the number of children per woman. You see the red line, which is the total population, and you see the thin green line, which is the life expectancy. How people get, of course, live longer and longer in the model system because, of course, the GDP grows, which leads to a higher public services, more health, more education, and so you get the whole thing. If you want to look at the GDP part, you see this is the blue line is the total GDP, which passes the roughly $120 trillion per year, which is the current thing, and then doubles or trebles during the rest of this century. This is, again, the value. And you must remember that one reason why the GDP is going to continue to grow is that there is as much GDP in ocean-going wind and CCS and renewable energy, and in helping the poor rather than giving the money to the rich. So, the GDP is totally uninteresting, as when you want to discuss long-term activities. You need to talk about people, workers, consumers, physical things, and their physical impact. So it grows, and you see the red line with the 10-year business cycles, the Marx growth cycles. The growth rate comes down from roughly, 5% a year at the beginning and down towards 1 or 2% per year at the end of this thing. And we then come to question number 4. So, will there be collapse? So I made the trite observation that we have not had global collapse during the last 50 years. The interesting question, will we get global collapse during the next 50 years? And as I showed you in our too little too late scenario, we don't get one. So, and if you then look into the possibility of a resource collapse, us running out of coal, oil, and gas, it looks very unlikely at this point in time. Then you can ask the question, will accelerating CO2 emissions actually lead to a sudden collapse of the Amazonian forest or a sudden sea level rise because of Greenland, suddenly melting? If you do, and we spent many years on climate modeling in our group, these things will not happen in 10 years to 30 years. These are on 500 to 5,000 year horizons. So in our mind, we will not get environmentally induced collapse. Could the agricultural system collapse? And the answer is that yes, it can. But the ability of fertilizer to shock and the overuse of food and the overproduction of food at this point in time is so vast that yes, you can a year or 2 or 3 and with horrible hunger, and of course you can have regions which have sustained hunger, but you don't get a situation in our view where you get a food collapse in the world. However, what you do get is the green line. And the green line is our well-being index. That's where we really start now to hammer on the GDP people. So you cannot and should not use GDP, the activity level of the economy, as a success measure. You should ask, what is the well-being of the average working person? Because it's the well-being of that person we're interested in doing something about, not the GDP. In the old days, GDP was useful because it was closely related to income, and since people were poor in this part of the world, it was useful to use the GDP because when it grew, incomes grew. But in the current situation, it is the well-being of people. It is not only, what their disposable income after taxes. It is also how much support do they get from the government. It is also how much environmental pollution is there in the environment. It is also very important the level of inequality in society. And it is the final 5th component that we use in our well-being indicator, which is the green one. It is hope for the future. It's the progress. It's the participation thing. You go to China today and you ask the Chinese, are you happy with the current situation? And they say, 2/3 of them say yes. And then you ask the question, or actually you should do it the following way. You ask on a scale from 0 to 10, how happy are you? And then they answer 6 or 7 or something like this. Then you ask, are you better off today than you were 5 years ago? And they say yes. And then you ask the really interesting question, 5 years in the future, what about that? Will you be better off 5 years in the future? And they answer yes. And so the important thing about society is to have a society where the majority of the people think that society is on its right way. It doesn't matter what that direction is, but if they have the feeling, this is well-being. And this is the way in which we have tried to summarize all these very soft issues. So if there is progress in the direction of increasing the well-being, that adds to the well-being. So when we calculate the well-being, you see it grew from 1980 up to 2010. This is, of course, a very, very rough average of the whole world, so it doesn't really mean anything in detail. But we had a general thing that during that period, incomes grew fast enough, and pollution levels were not high enough to start bothering. Inequality was low initially, and so it got worse. And so you see the thing peaks essentially now, 2010, 2020. And then we are, according to our view, facing a situation where global well-being will be declining over the next 30 to 60 years, while the GDP is going up. So there will be the activity level will be high, the rich will be getting richer fast, even the income component of people will go up, but the side effects will be overwhelming. So what we are then basically saying is that this decline in well-being is the real problem of 2020, because this continuing decade after decade of problems not being solved by society or the global society will lead to social tension, stress, frustration, even possibly conflict at the local level. So we are basically saying, as is then summarized hopefully in this one, so unless there is extraordinary action, I forgot to say that the too little, too late scenario, one should say that this is what will happen unless there is truly extraordinary action. Built into the system are the decision mechanisms of the last 40 years, the way we make decisions at the individual, societal, country level is built into that structure. So that leads to the problem. Of course, truly extraordinary action will help and can help. So unless we have this, average well-being will decline towards 2050, and this lack of progress will cause tension and increase the risk of local social collapse. So we're basically saying that what we will see over the next 30 to 60 years is nations failing. And they're not failing because of environmental reasons necessarily. It's much more likely they fail because of unemployment, because of inequality, because of lack of hope. Like the guys that flee now from Ukraine and Afghanistan, where they just give up, trying to do something at home. Ukraine was not a good example. Afghanistan is better. Or Somali would be another one. Fine. Question 5. And now I'm getting to the Per Espen mode, so now I'm going to smile. So here is the solution. And it's very simple. And how can we stop the decline in well-being? Because if we stop the decline in well-being, we avoid the social tension and the social conflict. And then the first thing you have to do is, of course, to define the well-being index. I've already done this for you, but it's in the slides so that you know. So you have to get a little bit further on the beyond GDP discussion that has now been going on for 30 years, modifying GDP to make it a welfare measure. No, it's not enough. You need to do something like this. And so we have chosen the 5 goals of what is called the Well-being Alliance of Nations. And these are 5 or so nations at this point in time that have chosen formally to change from GDP as the main measure to well-being being the main measure. So it's disposable income per person after tax, it's the government spending per person, it is the level of inequality, it's the observed global warming, and it's the perceived progress. So put equal weight on the 5, and then you have a much, much more useful guide to policy than if you're just using the value of the transactions during a year, which is the GDP. And so that's the first thing. So you need to have an indicator. And the second thing is that you need to eliminate the rising threats to well-being. And so what are the 5 things that needs to be done? So we have had endless discussions, and the UN has had endless discussions. They ended up with 256 Sustainable Development Goals, which is totally impractical, and particularly because it's also internally inconsistent. It doesn't work. So we try to simplify this at least down to 5 things. Eliminate global poverty, stop climate change, halt biodiversity decline, stop population growth, which is the same as reducing the consumption pressure. There are still vast groups in the West that believe that the solution is voluntary individual consumption decline, which that's nice that someone thinks this. This is a systemic problem. This needs to be solved by the whole system. You cannot rely on individual sacrifice, in a system like this. But please continue to do so because it doesn't hurt, and then the final thing, reduce inequality. And to be then even more Per Espen and more smile, I've indicated to you how simple it is to do those 5 things. So how do you eliminate global poverty? That means how do you do what Laila is doing, international development? We have tried now for the last 50 years, to get the South, moved, and we don't succeed. However, we are in the lucky situation that the Chinese has managed to double the income of 1.4 billion Chinese in 40 years. So at least it can be done. Most people, of course, this is the second way in which I define myself out of the good company. I am a strong supporter of China and its attempt at increasing the well-being of the Chinese population. Most people only say Uyghur, Hong Kong, Spratly Islands. And it's impossible to get to an interesting debate about alternative development methods and the Chinese model, which is to make 5-year plans, print the money that is necessary in order to implement those, give the money to the development banks that then orders the airports and the hospitals and the stuff. And then, since the plan is good, made by intelligent people in the party, it's consistent. They do these 5 years. Again, they don't change their mind on the morning after a 5-year plan has been, clapped in. They start discussing the next 5-year plan. And so these guys have shown that this is possible. But again, sorry for being the... So what I've been told by Per Espen is at this point in time, I should rather point to Costa Rica. Because Costa Rica is also, doing a good job. It's, of course, on a scale which is not consequential for the rest of the world, but they like this much better. And also the deglobalization type of efforts that are going on, where you stop having free trade and rather try to have shorter production chains. So more plan, less market. Stop climate change is totally simple. It's just to stop using coal, oil, and gas. The burning of coal, oil, and gas is 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions. If we stop using, producing, and burning coal, oil, and gas on a linear line from today to 0 in 2050, cutting 3% every year, that solves the whole problem. You can do it in the model system, and everything is fine. No, that was not mine. I'm glad. So this is replace fossils with wind and sun, increase energy efficiency, and here is interesting, from the model system, you need a huge amount of carbon capture and storage in order to keep the temperature down to plus 2.5 degrees, to keep the temperature below 2 degrees centigrade. Because most of the energy that is being used is heat. It has nothing to do with electricity. And you need for a long, long time to burn things in order to produce the heat. And you need actually, because we have been stupid enough to make the population as big as it is, you need a lot of gas in order to do this. And this gas, if it is burnt without carbon capture and storage, we blow the climate. And so, although my movement, the environmental movement, many thinking people in the concerned sustainable development areas hate carbon capture and storage and sees it as a continuation of the fossil age, the message is that this is absolutely necessary if we're going to keep the temperature below plus 2 degrees centigrade. And then it will be really important in the ensuing several hundred years, where we will hopefully try to draw the temperature back to the type of thing that was in the past. I don't think we're going to do it, but if we wanted to do it, carbon capture and storage is necessary. Sorry for this long one. I do this simply in order to make myself politically totally unacceptable. I'm in favor of population control, I'm in favor of China, and I'm in favor of carbon capture and storage. And I'm a 77-year-old environmentalist, science-based activist that has worked for such a long time. So I should be credible, but I am not, because of these three basic beliefs. And I think all those three things are totally essential if we want to solve the problem in time. Fine. How do you halt biodiversity decline? Very simple. You stop cutting the trees. And now we have cut so many of the trees in the world that all the clear-felled areas, you can continue for production of wood. But it should be a dead sentence on cutting an old-growth forest, a biodiverse thing, whether it is in Hedmark or in the Amazonas. So that's the simple thing. You just need to change our agricultural ways so we do not expand into the forest. And we need to do agriculture in a regenerative manner, which adds carbon into the soil instead of doing the modern way. This is doable. Stop population growth. That, luckily, is the only thing we have done well during the last 50 years. This you do by giving all women of the world education, health, contraception, and opportunity. Because women that have all of these things available do not choose to have 3 children. They don't even choose to have 2 children. We know that they end up, like Norway, having 1.5, which is wonderful, which is, And then, of course, the final thing, it should, in many ways, have been at the top, but it's pedagogically much easier to talk about it going down. It is to reduce inequality. And the only way to reduce inequality in a manner that actually matters is to make the rich pay for the higher well-being for the working majority. So you simply increase taxes on the rich, and you use the money to fund the government, so the government can provide health and education and contraception and opportunity and sun and wind and the whole schmear. And then I am getting to the end. I'm sorry if this ended up being too long. You get to the end, and here I show, so if you implement this in the model system, look at the green line, you can create a future world where well-being increases. But, of course, it does take those things. It is possible to achieve rising well-being during this century, but it will require strong collective action paid for by the rich, by higher taxes or unconventional means. The unconventional means is a reference to the Chinese way of doing this, which is that the government just prints the money that is necessary, so they don't have to bother the Chinese with taxes. As long as you do this in an organized manner, you don't get the inflation threat that rich people are worried about. Most people are not worried about inflation because most people's salaries are inflation-proofed. So this is a typical example of how the wealthy, the elite, has been able to form the institutions and the minds in such a way that we're stuck on the growth path. I am essentially done, except that I couldn't resist this one. And then I'm done. So these are my personal conclusions after 50 years, and I'll read them slowly so that you get the time to think. The sustainability problem can be solved using existing technologies. We already have the windmills and the solar panels and the contraception and the whole thing. It does not cost a lot. The cost of doing this is a few % of global income, between 2 and 4, according to most observers, which means that you need to move only 2 to 4% of the labor force from dirty jobs to clean, from making fossil plants to making sun and wind. That's the type of big shift. But the needed action is not profitable from the point of view. So that's the reason why nothing happens, is that it isn't profitable from the market, from the investor point of view, to do this shift. So free markets will not deliver. So we need more regulation, more taxes, and more subsidies to make what the world needs profitable, and more profitable than the alternative. It's difficult to gather democratic majority for such collective governmental action. This is to ask people to vote for parties that are for higher taxes. Even higher taxes on the rich is all you need, and for more regulation. And most people don't want more taxes and more regulation, and consequently, Rasmus and others have a hard time. We won't succeed unless the solution is perceived as fair, which means paid for by the rich minority. And the important point, and there I'll end, the 10% richest people in the world control 50% of the income. We need between 2 and 4% of total income to pay for the solution. We just ask those guys that already receive 50% of the income to pay to us the 2 to 4%. So it means increasing taxes on the rich of the order of 5%. The income taxes of the rich would solve the whole problem. I'm very pleased that you have not fell asleep. I'm very happy that you have not, at least expressed hate directly, and at least allowed me to talk all the way through. I know that this is not doable, but what else is there to do except trying? Because if I succeed at least a little bit, along with all the other people who are trying to push for the good thing, at least we get a little less bad future than we would otherwise have gone. And this is with a smile from Per Espen. Thank you very much. That's kind of you. Thank you.
Please take a seat. Jørgen, may I ask our panelists to join and have a seat? Help yourself. Yeah, anyone. Our first speaker today, the first intervention will be by Dr. Tone Smith. Tone is an ecological economist. She has worked at Statistics Norway, at the OECD, Vienna University of Business, and the Austrian Ministry of Sustainability. Tone is co-founder of Rethinking Economics Norway, where she still serves as a member of the advisory board, and she's active in international Degrowth Movement. She's also a member of the board of the European Society for Ecological Economics, which is a co-host of this event. Tune, we're so happy to have you here. The floor is yours. We will have interventions of 5 to 10 minutes. I must ask the speakers to please stick to time, because we would love to have time to discuss with the audience.
Yes, thank you very much. It will rather be 10 than 5 minutes, because there is just so much to comment on here. And yes, I think it's clear for everyone that the Limits to Growth report was a very important and milestone publication in the environmental movement and in exposing the inherent flaws in the modern industrial growth economy. I also want to start by taking a few moments to honor Jørgen, because even as you will see in my comments, we disagree on quite some points. Jørgen has really been patient and distinct voice in the Norwegian landscape, in particular. Very provocative, arrogant, as he likes to point out himself, so it's safe to say. The only one who dares to raise the population issue, and sometimes a very lonely voice in this quite heterogeneous landscapes of opinion in Norway. So I really want to thank you for that, Jørgen. Yes, I think you deserve actually an applause for that.
Luckily, I get much more applause abroad. You know, so that's why I hold out.
Yeah. Okay, so what I want to focus on is some nuances on the so-called solutions that you present, because first of all, I don't believe in solutions in the simplistic way, and I think we should talk about alternatives and also problematize things a bit more. Things are not this simple, and I also want to add some elements to what I think is important for moving this topic forward. And I don't totally agree with Jørgen that nobody has listened to this message, because there is actually, it is well known, and there is increasing today, really an increasing interest in debating alternative economic models, thinking about another kind of economy, interest in the degrowth movement, which I will also shortly touch upon. So there is hope in this, I really think so. But I want to start with a couple of insights from ecological economics as I presented the society today, and I think it's very relevant in this discussion. So Jørgen is recently been pointing out that there is a misunderstanding that GDP growth is the same as material growth. Now, ecological economists approach the economy by saying it has a biophysical basis. So it's a very simple and easily understandable model to present, even without slides, that to produce something you need resources and you need energy, and on the other side you get a product and you always get a waste product. No matter how much you try to have a circular economy, you will get waste products, and you need energy to produce. And this energy is not recyclable. So you didn't talk so much about renewable energies here, Jørgen, today, but this focus that tends to be in the green growth discourse about just switching from fossil energy to renewable is not a solution. It is too simple, and it will create problems. And we see it already. And one of the basic things from ecological economics that we know is that producing renewable energy is more energy intensive than extracting fossil fuels. So this is really not an easy way, easy solution. We have to talk about reducing energy as well. Reduction. It's unavoidable to get to this this word. Maybe it's negative, and we could say with a smile, and I will come to how actually it doesn't need to be such a problem. So I'm a bit disappointed about the turn of of the limits to growth, the continuation, moving from pointing out limits to stressing so much that GDP growth is not the same as material growth, because even though we can imagine that somebody who earns a lot of money on giving talks can buy art for this money comes from somewhere in the first place. And also, we see that this phenomenon is called changing the content of growth. It has been advocated for at least 40 years or so, since the Brundtland report in '87, and it does not happen. It is not an easy thing to do. We are not now all changing our material consumption for yoga classes, right? We are maybe taking some yoga classes on top of all the consumption, but it's coming in addition. So it's not an easy thing to do, and empirically we see that environmental load or environmental stress follows very closely GDP development. So let me move to my second point. In the solutions, there is very much a focus on money. We should, the rich should pay. I assume it's meant in monetary terms. And you talk about poverty and inequality, and these are all important concepts, but how should we address the issue? Now, what I would suggest is that we move again to the material level, and we say that the rich not only need to pay, but they need to be limited, right? We need to talk about, in material terms, people need to be limited in their consumption, and we need to limit in material term production. And maybe also wealth. So there is many ways to think about caps. In this respect, we can think about, there are many ideas out there now, caps on wealth, caps on income, caps on property, caps on private jets, things like this. Or maybe some of them should not be even allowed. And on the other side of this is the basic need fulfillment. So we have to think about the richest and the poorest. And I think this example from China could be quite interesting in this respect, because you talked about the 2/3 who are happy about the development. You didn't say so much about what the third that is not, what they think, but I think there is a risk here that exactly this development is happening at the cost of somebody else, at somebody else's expense, which is very much what the growth economy is about. Some groups pay the price for somebody else's wealth. And this is not in line with basic need approach. It is not in line with a human rights approach. And we really need to talk about these aspects as well when we discuss how to have a more fair and equitable society. So my last point, I just want to raise the issue of the degrowth movement. Because the degrowth movement is sometimes misunderstood to be about just reducing growth. And from what I just said, it is clear that ecological economists and also degrowth activists see the need for reduced growth and production amongst wealthy people and in rich countries. But degrowth is actually, at its essence, about something very different, because this movement started at the same time as the Limits to Growth report appeared, so roughly in the beginning of the 70s in France, and it was a counter movement to the modern Western development model being pushed onto former colonies and poorer countries. A model whereby all the economic structures are transformed to the modern model. So we all should follow this model development path, including wage labor, including privatization of property, etc. That was what it was about, and the opposition was about. And degrowth doesn't mean reduced growth. It means creating an economy and a society that is not obsessed with this idea of growing all the time, and an economy that doesn't depend on growing. So really key to solving the problem then is to figure out how we can create a different kind of economic system that doesn't have these dynamics that lead to growth and that depend on growth, economic growth, right? And economic growth is closely related to environmental destruction, as I have argued. So this is the challenge, and this is the aim of the degrowth movement. And the focus is, I think, a bit more, quite a different nuance in terms of thinking about the people that we want to have, think about what a good life for all is, not just the 2/3, but for everyone in the whole world, not just in some countries in the global north. And focus on sufficiency as something that can be positive. Sufficient is good enough. Basic needs might be good enough. And then other kinds of meaning or fulfillment in lives can be non-material. And interestingly, even the latest IPCC report that came out a couple of months ago has started to pick up on these ideas and insights. So I think there is really hope in this questioning growth and thinking about limits. Yet again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tone. Our next speaker is Mr. Espen Barth Eide. Espen Barth Eide is Norway's Minister of Climate and the Environment. He's been a member of the parliament between 2017 and 21, and he's been the Norwegian Labour's Party climate and energy spokesman. Mr. Eide has occupied many prominent positions, including Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Defense, State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, and State Secretary for Defense. Mr. Eide was Managing Director and member of the Managing Board of the World Economic Forum, and has served as United Nations Under Secretary General and the Secretary General's Special Advisor for Cyprus. For over a decade, he has been Vice President of the Party of European Socialists. And in his academic career as a political scientist, he has worked as a senior fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs from 1993 to 2000, and then from 2002 to 2005, specializing on international security, European integration, defense, and international relations. Minister, we are aware that you had a very packed agenda today and that you will have to leave a little bit before the finish of the event, and we're so happy and honored to have you here. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here, and the reason I have to leave a little early is that I have to see the king at 11, and he doesn't wait. But great to be here, and Jørgen, I think it's great to be in your company again. I believe 1972 was an incredible year. We had Limits to Growth, which I think is a seminal work, and a lot of academic and political work, I would argue, followed from that thinking. And I think we're seeing this. I mean, what, for instance, Johan Rockström has done lately on the planetary boundaries is also very much in line with the work that you started, and you were among the first. It was also the year of the first UN environmental conference ever. And last week I was in Stockholm to celebrate what was called Stockholm Plus 50, which was exactly that. It was the then Swedish government that invited the UN to talk about these issues. And Olof Palme, who was the Prime Minister of Sweden at the time, warned against the threat of ecocide and the serious consequences of this. So out of that came UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Programme, and out of that UNEP came the Gro Harlem Brundtland report on sustainable development, and that led to the Rio conference in 1992. And out of the Rio conference, we got the climate work of the UN, the IPCC. We got the biodiversity work of the UN, and also the work that is now being done on pollution and waste management and so on. So all this work actually has its roots in 1972. And you were a part of it, and you were part of inspiring the world to take action on this. You were right, and you are right. I mean, the analysis, as you showed, was very precise. And it's also right on the very big picture level that we haven't done even close to what we should have had. I agree with you. It has to be said, though, as Tone said, that said, a lot has happened. There is a growing awareness, there is a growing willingness in governments, in international organizations, in the business sector, in investor circles, in innovation circles among consumers, to take this much more seriously. Way late, and much later than it should have been, by all means. I totally agree with that. But stuff is happening now. And one example is the recognition that I see in more and more circles now, nationally and internationally, that we have to stop believing in just incremental change. We need a transformative change of the whole system. You know, you really have to take all aspects of the economy and reorganize it for basically two purposes: to move as fast as we can to net zero emissions, and secondly, to move towards a nature positive economy. The European work that we are deeply integrated into of the European Green Deal and its Fit for 55 package, its taxonomy work and so on, is a good example of that, because it basically says, let's look at every sector of the economy and ask that sector, is it ready for 55% cut until 2030 and then net zero in 2050? The answer is obviously normally no. And then you say, then what do we do? How do we rearrange incentives, tax systems, innovation support and so on, in order to make this sector and the value chains related to that fit for this massive decarbonization, this deep decarbonization drive? That's incredibly inspiring, and I think we're seeing now that much of that thinking is now being broadened into the whole OECD economy. The current US administration is largely thinking in the same direction. And I agree also that while we might disagree on other aspects of Chinese administration, the current 5-year plan has a focus on ecological civilization, which recognizes that you can't just grow, you have to look into the quality of growth even in China. That's actually true. I've been there, talked to them, and I think it's genuine. That's incredibly important, because without China you can't do it. So there is a development now moving in the right direction, but of course it would have been much easier if we had started earlier. Deep decarbonization, it's absolutely correct that it requires the substitution of fossil energy with clean energy. That's a no-brainer. Of course, you need much more. First, you need energy efficiency. Absolutely, you need to use energy much more smartly. Partly that comes from free when you go for electrification, because simply, an electric car simply uses much less primary energy to move 1 kilometer than a fossil car. So some of that comes for free, but you need to do much more on energy efficiency. Secondly, you need to produce all that energy, and I deeply and completely agree with Jørgen that you need CCS, because while I would like our future gases, which we need to be green, in the sense of green hydrogen and ammonia produced via green hydrogen, we will not have volumes large enough if we don't also do blue hydrogen. It simply doesn't add up. So you need CCS, and that would produce an alternative to the current fossil emissions-bearing energy sources, which is coal, oil, and gas. And the environmental movement simply have to get to grips with that. It doesn't add up without. It sounds good, but it doesn't work in practice. You need to get CCS as part of it, and I'm glad you're saying that. But what we sometimes forget is that even if you manage to produce all that energy, and of course minus all that you save, because Tony is right on that, you still need to be able to apply it, because having it doesn't mean you can use it, because most energy use does not go via electricity, it goes direct. So you really need to also develop the usage in agriculture, in fisheries, in transports, in buildings, in industry. So the energy transition is incredibly necessary, but also incredibly complex. It really requires the change of millions of things more or less at the same time. So that's why you really need, and I really believe that Norway needs to be a key driver of that, together with all our allies. And if anybody believes that just stopping the production of petroleum will fix it, it won't, because, feel free to stop, but it will not create all that transformation by itself. You need to actually have a much more organized transition from it's a travel from A to B. When at the World Economic Forum in Davos 2 weeks ago, I heard more about deep transformation, deep decarbonization, and fundamental reorganization of value chains that you sometimes hear in, for instance, Norwegian politics. It is really on the agenda of big business because they see, that they are part of the problem and need to be a part of the solution, but they also understand that there's an increasing understanding that the economy that they obviously have been winners of, that's why they're large companies, is based on some physical premises which is being undermined by their very activities. But they also see that as the green transition is happening, it's better to take a position in what is growing than what is going down. It's actually not particularly smart as an investor to invest in, the 20th century economy when you see the 21st century economy coming along. So there is a very substantive development among investors and big business. That's great. Now, what they want to produce is equality. That really requires much more governmental effort, and they will not on their own be able to connect all the value chains. So that's why I also agree with you, Jørgen, that we're seeing a shift towards more planning, a more industrial policy, more direction, and that's a major change from the sort of 1990s onwards, strong belief in a liberal market economy. So if you still teach that at BI, tell your colleagues to stop doing it because it's out of fashion in modern Western politics. There are few politicians, even on the nominal right, who believe in that. It's a major, major change. The European Union, which some people in Norway, they use the script from the last 2 EU debates and believe that they're debating the same animal. It's a deeply social, democratic, regulatory system that is trying to intervene in all aspects of the economy, provoking people like the other side of BI, because it's totally different from what it used to be, because now it's very much about seeing how can you move towards net zero and beyond, carbon positive, but also nature positive. Because on the nature side, we can't just stop building down nature, we have to build up again. And there's actually also money in doing that, doing the right thing. My last point, moderator, is that as long as the economy is predominantly fossil and linear, it's somewhat costly to go renewable and circular. But when the economy becomes predominantly renewable and circular, it will be costly to remain fossil and linear. So what's happening now is that a number of actors in governments, in international organizations, in the business world are trying to say, let's leapfrog, let's be early movers, let's take that early cost of taking positions in what will be. And by that, we're reducing the unit cost because, as we know, if you build enough windmills, they will be much cheaper than if you build a few. If you build more solar panel, electric cars and whatever, they will be cheaper, and eventually they will compete in the market. So we have to get that transformation right. I think it's genuinely true to say that the future is renewable, circular, and sustainable. We just have to get there. And the challenge for politics and actors in the economy now is to get there faster. I am increasingly convinced that we are moving in the right direction, but I am far from convinced that we're moving in the right direction fast enough, given the very limited carbon budgets that remains. And that, I think, is really where we have to start this discussion.
Thank you very much for your intervention. Our next speaker is Marie Sneve Martinussen. Marie is Vice President of Rødt, Norway's Red Party, and a member of the Parliament, where she holds a place in the Parliament's Committee on Finance. She's an economist and an activist with a background in the Norwegian youth NGO Natur og Ungdom, Nature and Youth. Before going into politics on full-time, she was an economist in the Norwegian Environmental Agency, Miljødirektoratet, Maria, so happy to have you here.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, and first thank you to Professor Randers for an inspiring speech, but also a book that was inspiring to me as a young student and still is now as a more grown-up, I hope, politician. First, I have to tell a small anecdote from the University of Oslo, where there is a study hall for all the students of economics, and in that study hall, someone has put up, not me, someone else, has put up a poster saying, if you believe in infinite economic growth, you're either a madman or an economist. And I guess that's actually concludes some of the very important critique that Randers has given to the field of economics, and especially, of course, the classical direction that this subject has taken most, well, in most educational institutions also in Norway. I thought firstly I would like to comment on the fact that we're sitting quite comfortably in one of the richest countries in the world, and it's easy for us to conclude that there has not been a global collapse. But the situation for other people in the world is that it feels a lot like a global collapse. Maybe it's not global in a modeling sense of way, but it is local, regional, and for those people, it is a true collapse. In their well-being, when there are wildfires in Australia, in Africa, in America, when there are inequality that has risen both the last 40 years, but increasingly during the pandemic, where we have still a large part of the world's population not vaccinated. We have the joy of being here together physically, but for very many other people in the world, that's not a possibility. And at the same time, the monopoly on vaccines has created more dollar billionaires than, and quicker than the previous decades. So you're actually in the middle of what I would say for many people in the world very much feels like a global collapse. And on top of that, we have extinction of species. The UN's panel on nature, the IPBES, when then they launched the latest report, they concluded that 1 million species of the world's 8 million are being threatened to get extinct. And that we, the human race, now causes an extinction of species that is 10 to 100,000 times faster than ever before. So to me, it kind of feels like a collapse. A slow collapse maybe, but a collapse. And that the growth we still have in GDP, where the measure that economists swear to focus on, has been made on the cost of others. That's the inequality, both locally and globally. And in many ways, the last slides from Professor Randers was interesting because it says that it is easily done and it's better for everyone. So it's better also for the rich because they don't want social tension and it's easier for them. So why doesn't it happen? And as a student, I learned a lot about this term, the tragedy of the commons. And I feel that that's not true. It's not a tragedy of the commons we're in. It's a tragedy of the few. The tragedy of the few with a lot of power. Because for them individually, in their company, for their wealth and their fortune, it is easier to not do the transformative actions that's needed to be done for them individually. But obviously, for us, for the commons, it's better if it's done. So it's kind of, I don't know if that's a term, but if I were to go back to, if I were to go into academia, maybe that would be something to work on if any of you are into this, to try to coin a new field, a new term, the tragedy of the few, because those are the few that holds the power and are not individually profits from doing the transformation. So, turning to the way forward, I'll try to sum up 4 points that I think is important and that should be discussed more. Firstly, when we talk about environmental issues, we have to stop being one-dimensional. We very often talk about emissions of climate gases, for example. Very important. Very, very important. But we can never evaluate policies on one dimension only. nature, another important aspect, has to be included. And as we know, I'm not a biologist, but I used to work in an agency with a lot of very good biologists and other fields of expertise. And the nature and the ecosystems, they are everything but one-dimensional. They're million-dimensional. They're all the things that relies on each other, and where a collapse can be actually difficult for us even to foresee when will happen and how will happen. So we have to stop being one-dimensional, and the second one is that we have to reduce, not substitute. It's quite easy, especially for an economist, to have like a formula where you just want to substitute one of the elements, for example, fossil fuels for renewable fuels. But we have to reduce consumption all over, and that's where the growth limits turns. I have another anecdote. One of the richest men in Norway became very angry at me when I once in a debate said that we should ban private jets, which is actually a stand that my party holds, that we should ban them. And he said, well, I just invested in a much more greener private jet. And that has actually cut emissions by da-da-da-da. And that's like, it's the most funny joke ever, because that's the scope sometimes especially on the right side of policies, when you talk about climate policies. Like, oh, hooray, we have a greener private jet. Congratulations to you. And the third point is that the environmental policies has to be fair and just, and that's where I guess my hope in the future is a bit bigger than Professor Randers, because I actually think there is possible to do things. Because we have a democracy, and the great thing about a democracy is that the majority has the power in the end in elections. But then, obviously, the environmental policy has to be fair and just. It has to be better for the majority. And that has been, I guess, a problem in discussion, where I thought I would just give one compliment to the minister. For example, the subsidies on electric cars are now being changed so that the most expensive cars do not get the biggest subsidies. And that is, I get, technically maybe not very big change, but I think mentally for people in Norway, how we view environmental policies, it has a lot to say. Because I guess every time a person with a low income hears about these big cars that are super expensive, they get very angry, and they get angry with environmental policy. So doing that change is actually very important. And also, another tip, I guess, for policy's future would be to do the same on on energy efficiency. Because now the support you get for building a solar panel or very expensive things is much bigger than if you want to just change your windows, because they're from the 50s and they leak heat all the time. And even though an economist would say that, oh, people should just do that investment because it's a profitable investment, the people who need to do it, they don't have that capital, or they don't have that possibility to do it. That would also be a fair and just, and also very symbolic policy. And the fourth point is very short. It's just that, obviously, as concluded by Professor Randers, it is the female population that will solve all these problems, as always is when there is problems. And that this is a very important point, because in some parts of the world, the fight for women's rights are in a backlash. In the USA, for example, the abortion rights are being attacked. In some countries, the far right or the extremists are allowed to take back the rights that women have achieved. And this is an issue that is impossible to decouple from the prospects of sustainable growth, a sustainable future. That we need to remember that the women have a key part, and that the rights and liberty should be at the core of every discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your intervention. Our next and final speaker is Professor Laila Mehta. Laila Mehta is a professor at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex and a visiting professor at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. She has conducted extensive research using the case of water and sanitation to focus on the politics of scarcity, limits, uncertainty, rights and access to resources, resource grabbing, and power and policy processes. Laila has conducted extensive research and field experience in India and Southern Africa, and she is the co-editor of several international scientific journals. Laila, so happy to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
The floor is
you.
yours.
Thank you, Eric. It's an honor to be here, and thank you so much for your 50 years of incredible hard work and persistence. And of course, you know, there's a long way to go, but there's been successes along the way. So in the 1970s, when all this was happening, I guess it really raised critical questions about scarcity amongst plenty and the imperative of humankind to really take the one planet that we have really seriously. And today, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. We have climate and financial crisis, wars all over. So these messages are really, really relevant. But now let's look at some of the wider framings and also some of the politics around scarcity and limits. At the time when you were finalizing the report in another part of the world, the Barlosch Foundation in Argentina argued and also came up with models and spoke about a desirable social future based on equality and full participation of all its members. And this was a sort of Latin American world model. It was a kind of global south, so-called then third world kind of response. It also provided advanced calculations and simulations to show that these limits were really needed, especially to curb inequitable allocation of resources between societies and unfair levels of consumption. So it kind of focused not just on demography and economics, but also on political and ideological variables. And I think these are really very, very critical. So the focus was on differences between consumption rates in rich and poor countries and the impacts of poverty on material well-being. We don't hear much about this group, partly because then there was a dictatorship and the people had to flee, but it also asks questions about, you know, whose voices count, whose framings ultimately persist or not. And, you know, a Global North report counts versus something that came out from the Global South. So let's talk a little more about some of these politics, the politics of knowledge, the politics of scarcity, and the politics of limits. So some of the doomsday predictions were right, some of them were not. But despite all the problems, obviously, we realize we really need to focus on limits. We know from Aristotle that if you want satisfaction and happiness, you need limits to growth, to greed, to allow for human flourishing and the good. But I guess it's really important to know that a lot of these issues around limits are not absolute. They always mean different things to different people. So we really need to look at some of the political nature of these limits. What counts as basic needs in one society could be luxuries elsewhere. You know, your example of the private jet, for example. So who is setting the limits and thresholds, and what are we really happy to accept? Why are we accepting that 1,000 babies and women are walking for water, are dying for water every day? And now we've moved to the planetary scale. We're in the era of the Anthropocene. We're talking about planetary boundaries. But again, still, missing is a sense of unevenness in how these processes play out in different parts of the planet and why these shifts affect different locales, species, or social groups. So we really need to call out the powerful. I like your idea of calling out the few. So call out the powerful actors. And we really need to look at the differences between the global and north and south, look at historic specificities, look at colonial legacies, etc. And when we're talking about governing within limits, be careful that you don't, again, put disproportionate burden on the poor, because it's invariably the poor that are going to bear the brunt of these limits. Renewable energy, great. Whose lands are we grabbing when we're doing renewable energy parks? It's poor people's lands, right? It's not the rich that are paying the price for it. When we're talking about carbon offsetting, whose lands are being taken? So really, when we're talking about living within limits, be careful of how this is panning out. Now, I want to turn to overpopulation. Yes, often the solutions are women are supposed to save the world in many, many different ways. And also, you know, the blame is put on women in terms of overpopulation. And it's usually not white, rich women in rich countries. It's poor and brown and black women who have been subjected to a lot of population control in very, very uneven ways. So fixation on overpopulation will ignore focusing attention on more crucial aspects, such as how is power distributed in society, unequal gender, caste, and racialized and ethnic discrimination, unfair terms of trade, state planning, centralized technologies, etc. I've been part of several global processes, the high-level panel of experts on food security, the UNDP, and currently IPIS. There's enough water and food to go around. But we still have a chronic problem of hunger. Despite the fact that there's more than enough food to feed everybody, we still have perverse subsidy regimes here in Europe, in the EU, in the global north. Hunger and obesity are two sides of the same coin. So I guess the scare of overpopulation, and even all these things that are coming out from the UK, from Prince William, from Richard Attenborough, focusing on this one planet, etc., really move attention from focusing on the issues of implicating the politically powerful. So I guess we really also need to move away from some of these economic perspectives around looking at limits and growth. There are many limits and scarcities that are very real and non-material in nature. The scarcity of time, the scarcity of love, the scarcity of happiness, the scarcity of care. So let's move away from some of this ecological economic logic to look also at some of these wider questions, but also how these are molded by coloniality, by race, by class, and gender, and tease out some of these non-material aspects of growth. So I guess, you know, we are living in extraordinary times. We have a pandemic, we have a climate crisis, we have these wars, and massive change has been possible in this time. We know that our survival is being threatened, but will this lead to an end of kind of short-term business-oriented thinking? I mean, you said very profound things, but you have to negotiate with your treasury, your economists. There's oil. Norway's economy is based on oil, so, you know, there are lots of hypocrisies even within Norway. And, you know, why is it that the thinking of the World Bank, the IMF, the Treasury, I mean, why is that kind of thinking, why is that the one that prevails? So we really need to go beyond that and look at sort of non-economic ways of looking at the world, replacing efficiency, for example, with sufficiency, challenging power, looking at visions to build society based on caring relations, well-being, equity. So I guess what I also want to say is we are on one planet, but we're not all one. It's many different planets within this planet. So don't make the poor bear the cost. Go after the few. I think that's what we need to do. Go after the few. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laila. We're soon moving to the debate with the audience, but Espen will have to leave us now for his appointment, so I would like to give you the opportunity if you would like to make any comment or reaction.
So very quickly, I think these were excellent interventions, and I very much would like to agree with Maria that if the transition is not just, there will just be no transition. It's simply not possible. It's theoretically possible, but it's not politically possible to manage such a large transition without thinking about the distributional effects. And the phase that we're going into now, deep decarbonization, it will create a better world and so on, but it will also move power. And it's not only, I mean, yes, it's from rich to the average, I agree, and that's a good thing, but it also means that people who do not identify as rich will lose something before they win something else. And we have to be honest on that. So while I'm totally in agreement with saying let's make the rich pay more, all for it, everybody will have to contribute and to try to, you're not saying that by no means, but I mean, if anybody hears that if the rich pay, everybody else will be not affected, it's not true. We have to be honest, everybody's life will be different, but different does not mean bad. It can actually mean better, but people's lives will change, and we have to be honest about it, and we have to be more honest about it because it's been too comfortable to say that you will do more or less the same. You will still drive to work, but you will drive in an electric car. Well, it's still better that you walk or bike or take the bus. Because electric car is still a car. And it's even better, if you have electric cars, it's better that it's part of a sharing pool than you have one on your own. And because the sharing economy creates a lot of opportunity to have the same service, which is I want to go from A to B when I want to. I don't need to own the thing. So I think there is something here that we have to take from, let's say, the more radical and marginal economic thinking and into mainstream thinking, which will reduce that sense of deprivation by moving into a smarter economy. So that's the last thing I wanted to say here. And then I want to say that I very much look forward to presenting this government's first climate plan this autumn. We deliberately do it together with the state budget because we have to go into the machine room of the economy. It cannot any longer be just my ministry doing its marginal stuff on the side, and then we forget it when we come to the transport plan. We have to deeply integrated this, and that is true. I have to negotiate with a lot of ministers, but I'm working on it, and it's not looking that bad. So I look forward to that, and that will then repeat itself in the coming years, so that we actually manage to do our part. Thank you.
Listen back. So we're running short of time, but we still have some 15 minutes for a debate with the audience. So I will ask anyone in the audience that wants to make a question to raise your hand, present yourself, and please keep questions short and to the point. Maybe we could start here.
Thank you. My name is Bent Erik Bakken. I'm Professor Emeritus of Complex Systems at the Oslo Met University. I thank everyone here, but Jørgen, of course, in particular. He was extremely inspirational to me in 1972 and actually followed in his footsteps to the MIT's System Dynamics group some 10 years after he had left. I think, Jørgen, that one of your most interesting points is that democracy will not lead to sustainability. We need a system by, as we see in China, 5-year plans. Democracy with short-termism will not do the trick. People think only about their own selves, and short cycles, it will not do the trick. My counterpoint is two. First, we saw in the 30s the Nazis. They certainly had extremely strong public control over the economy. On the other side, they didn't really have a democracy, and a lot of us didn't really like what happened in the concentration camps and the gas ovens there.
Excuse me, may I ask you to
Yes, of course. Sorry. Secondly, in China, things are good, but in Soviet Union, 5-year plans didn't quite do the trick, and it's quite clear that if the Soviet Union had continued, it's not at all sure that they would have favored a sustainability economy instead of an oil and gas economy. So how can you guarantee that a future society that is not democratic is not, a future that is counting on oil and gas instead of sustainable energy?
Thank you very much. Any direct reactions or responses?
For the time, should we maybe gather up? There was like 4 other people having comments.
Okay.
And some women too. In the back there.
Okay, I take note of that. I see at least one woman with raised hand in the back there.
Bare gutta.
Leticia Antunes Nogueira, Senior Researcher at Norland Research Institute in Bodø. Two questions about the population issue. The first is, how do you reconcile a declining population with the issue of welfare? Is it just by taxing the rich or printing money? How can we keep welfare and pensions, and how do we solve this if you have a declining population? And the other, also on population, I'm glad to hear the issue of reproductive rights being mentioned, because this is essential and not only an assault on women's rights, but has implications on this. So my question was, in a democratic perspective, what can we do against this? Because it's not only the United States, in all of Latin America, abortion is prohibited, and we see in Europe the religious right. So is it about not doing it democratically, or how can we do it? What can we do in a democratic and systemic perspective? Thank you.
Yes, we have another one here.
Hi, my name is Bjørn Grimsby, and I'm a master of nature-based tourism from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on nature-based tourism as a possible solution to this production, overconsumption of tangible assets. Just like your thoughts on how this can, how this is. What are your thoughts on nature-based tourism as a possible solution to all this?
Thank you. I think we had another question there.
Thanks. Nick Fitzpatrick, PhD candidate in ecological economics. Question to Randers about inequality. You mentioned that, the work from Thomas Piketty kind of suggests that when taxing the rich, it needs to reach rates around 80 to 90% with caps on wealth and income. And your research is suggesting increasing the tax on the rich by 3 to 5%. Could you just explain the differences or justify your conclusions? Thanks.
We'll take one more question.
Lars Henning Wenche. I also work at the environmental agency, but I'm here on my day off in private, just to be clear about that. The minister, it's a shame the king couldn't wait, because it would be interesting to hear what he has to say, but in his reasonably sounding logic, there is a premise that energy demand is fixed, or perhaps even growing. So I'll ask the question to the other politician, and I think for Rødt this is equally, if not more relevant. In Norway, we have the highest per capita emissions in Europe, and that's per capita, so on average. We have among the highest material footprints in the world, so it's not only about the few. In a global perspective, all of us in the room here are the top 1%. When is a Norwegian politician going to address that we cannot have 2 cabins and 3 cars, that we cannot take 5 plane trips on average? If Rødt, and I see Rasmus Hansson is also here, MDG, you guys are also not addressing this. So if you guys aren't talking about it, how can we expect the more centrist parties to address this? So when are you going to start addressing this elephant in the room?
Thank you very much. May I give the word to the panel. Jørgen, you had some direct questions, I think. We have to keep the answers short because we're running out of time. We have 10 minutes left.
Oh, Jesus. So, wonderful points of view. It just shows that what is needed is a transformation, as has been said, and of course, no one has ever said that we need a simple solution, and that a simple solution is available. This is a complex issue. That's why I always talk for 40 minutes. I don't accept speaking engagements at less than 40 minutes, because there's no way you can handle all the aspects. And of course, all the ones that was brought out by the panel, I solidly agreed. Yeah, fine. And so the question is, how do I then try to say something which sums up and is educational and brings the thing a little bit further? And I think it is to tell an anecdote. Because once I had been screaming about sustainability for 35 years. So in 2005, the Prime Minister called and said, Jørgen, I get furious. So he says, he said, Bodvik, no, yes, oh God knows who was it in 2005. So he called and he said, we are going to run a climate commission. You know, we want to make a political, an NOU on how does Norway reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 2/3 by 2050. This was in 2005. You know, this was before Stern. Norway, my commission, unanimously presented a 250-page NOU in the fall of 2006, which contained the 15-point plan on what needed to be done in Norway in order to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 2/3 by 2050. The Commission, which worked for 18 months with a great support team from the institutions that you have all mentioned here, we chose, there are many ways to do this, so we chose the simplest 15 ways of doing this, presented the plan, and expected to be celebrated. Because here we finally, this is how to do it. It required 15 decisions in Parliament, and that was it. And what happened? Immediately, the whole economic and establishment system said, but this plan is not cost efficient. So it's not an economic plan. So the finance ministry immediately said that, we're not interested. We want the optimal way, of solving the problem. We don't want this idiot Randers, idiot engineering, idiot type of plan. And we said, come on, isn't the goal to try to cut greenhouse gas emissions? No, that is not. We want an optimal, cost-efficient approach. So it was immediately, and so when later the history of the government's climate plans was written by Torvald Moe, who was the senior servant in the Ministry of Finance for many years. It lists the 12 plans that Norway has made, omitting lavutslippsutvalget, because lavutslippsutvalget was not made by economists, and it was not a cost-effective plan. I then spent 3 years of my life traveling Norway to try to sell the plan, because then I was the real science-based activist that I am. I thought, fuck the government, and fuck the macroeconomist, and fuck cost efficiency. We have a real problem, and the problem is solvable, and here are the 15 things. I traveled, and we had even calculated the cost. So the cost of doing this was 2,000 kroner per Norwegian per year. So I traveled and told about the 15 things that needed to be done, and that if they just increased the income tax in Norway from 33% to 34% on the average group, this would finance the whole thing. And everywhere talking about this. Gradually, I then start to see that in any typical audience of 100 people, there would be 3 people who said, this is fabulous, and the other 97 would be saying, am I going to pay 2,000 kroner in order to create a potentially better future for my spoiled children, 30 to 60 years into the future? Because there is uncertainty here. people would be repeating and repeating and repeating. And this is not fair that I should pay because Mr. Ultveit Moe, should pay at least 10,000 as much as me or the guy with the jet, so Yelsten or whoever it is. And but I kept at it because I'd been used to keeping at it. And then after 4 years, Rasmus, my dear friend, and we were then jointly the leadership of WWF in Norway, trying to conserve nature here and the rest of we started to give up. And then enters the MDG, the Miljøpartiet De Grønne. And we said, fine, let's check now whether in reality we are in a situation, which I think we are, namely that 97% of Norwegians are not willing to pay 2,000 kroner per year in order to solve the problem. And now I'm addressing you. We have tried the experiment of launching a political party into this short-term, focused democracy of highly educated Norwegians with welfare up and down and back and forth, and the most egalitarian society, big society on the surface of the earth. So we launched this thing, and what do we get? We get 3.7% of the vote. So exactly what I said, in any audience of 100 people, there are 3 people that are willing to do a collective sacrifice. That's when I gave up, last time, 11 years ago. I said, Jesus Christ, when even in Norway you can't get this done. And so this forms my answer to everything that has been said here. I have given up pursuing ideal solutions a long, long time ago. I'm trying to find those few things that it conceivably could be a majority in democratic society in favor. I am giving up. I am the leader of the Center for Ecological Civilization in the Ski Institute at the Peking University. That's where we're teaching ecological civilization, the other way around, where you basically have a meritocracy, competent people that makes the plans. So comparing with, the Soviet type of thing is a little bit unfair, and particularly, okay. So the point is that I have ended up having to lower my ambition level dramatically down towards those things that hopefully are acceptable in Norway. And unless things are acceptable in Norway, they won't be acceptable anywhere else, because inequality and poverty and distribution and unfairness and inability and everything is so much worse everywhere that getting this done is difficult. So that's sorry for the long answer, but instead of starting to give a long answer on each of the very, very valid points that have been put forward, I'm saying that I'm being forced by a long life in the war to start focusing on those few things that might be doable, instead of approaching this at the idealistic level, where you basically say, we want structural change into a new sustainable structure. A structural revolution will never happen. It can only happen through stepwise things, unless you do like Mao did. You spent 30 years getting the power, and then you impose your new system on an unwilling audience. And that, I don't think, is going to happen.
So it's almost time, but fortunately the moderator grew up in a Latin country, so I'll take the liberty to make this a little bit flexible. And because I would not like to close before giving an opportunity to the other panelists to make a comment, but I have to ask you to keep it short and to the point. So Maria, would you like to start?
Well, I'll be super short. It might be that when I'm 77 that I also will give up, but hopefully I haven't yet, and I don't think people should. if they have the energy to not give up, that would be the best. Because even though democracy has its flaws, it is the best possible way forward, I think, because every other alternative will gather power on the hands of few and will be impossible to forecast. If it's like a good dictatorship or a bad one, it will be impossible to foresee, and that's why I feel that democracy is our only way forward. But the very, very important question is, do we have a real democracy at this point? And that's where I could start like an hour-long lecture, because I'm a socialist, and I feel that the capitalist society in itself is it's not a perfect democracy, both in our countries, respectfully, or the different countries, like in Norway. I don't know if you heard all the scandals about politicians in parliament who become lobbyists for companies after they stop being a member of parliament, and then they spend their power and network gaining a high salary and also imposing the interests of big companies in Norway, especially obviously the oil and gas industry, but also the food companies. That's just one example of reasons why we're not in a perfect democracy, and also obviously the power. We have a vote every 4th year or every 2nd year if you count the local votes, where you can affect on who's in parliament. But I would say that the credit card, or like the money that you hold in your bank account, sometimes imposes more power than the ballot that you use in an election. And that's why this makes it a bigger problem, and would say that I would give up even faster, because I've now created like an even bigger problem than what we've been discussing up till now. But it also creates the hope, because the thing is that what we have is the possibility to raise a power of the many, and that's where the things that Lydia talked about comes in, at both locally and globally. The way to look beyond historical structures that has given power to both globally and locally an elite, and in many ways that's the only way forward, I would say, for both the environmental issues but also to create a real democracy. Because it's true that Norway as a whole is a part of it's like the richest part of the world, but I think in a society where the like 40% lowest in income statistics has been worse off for like 15 years now, and especially now during the pandemic, with layoffs and decline in income, and also now the prices on necessities rising, you need to show that, okay, they will, like you do in a dugnad, they will contribute, but other people with a lot of power and more responsibilities will actually contribute more. Because what we see now is that we ask them to contribute, and then the chief of the oil companies or whoever, they do not contribute at all, both privately and also as like a company. And that destroys the dugnadon, as we would say in Norway, and it makes it very, very difficult to get people to take part in environmental policies. But I think if we want to get there, democracy is the only way, but we should maybe more questions. Do we really have true democracy? And what changes should we make in like making it visible who's affecting policies, for example, like lobby things, and also like structurally in the ownership. When the ownership is so focused on few hands, like it is, for example, in the food industry, there's 2 or 3 companies controlling the whole food industry in Norway. That's a difficult way, or is a difficult starting point for political process and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Tone?
Yeah, I totally agree that we need to open up the debate about democracies, and we see this democratic participation in Europe, for example, is going down, and this needs to be reinvigorated. And one of the things that Jørgen, your Earth for All project has suggested is to, which I thought was really interesting, is to create citizens' assemblies that discuss how to reform the economic system. And this is a great idea, and it goes actually to the heart of trying to to, in a participatory way, engage people in systemic change. So yeah, I think this is excellent. It goes against what you just said about system change. There are ways even to do it in a participatory way.
How many public assemblies do you think we assembled during Lavutslippsutvalget? We worked for 1.5 years. We traveled, we organized big meetings all over the country doing this. So it's a wonderful idea.
Yes, it's a wonderful idea.
But it doesn't help.
Well, we'll see. Just to address the issue of Norwegian quality or level material wealth in general, because I think it was very interesting what the minister said, that there are people who don't identify as rich. I think this is an excellent, actually, expression or insight, because in Norway this is really the problem. People don't identify as rich, and Norwegian people are rich. On a global scale, we are extremely rich. And therefore, this makes it really problematic in Norway to discuss a fair transition, because the whole debate becomes very nationally focused, and those who are poorer in Norway think they are poor, but on a global scale, people are in general very wealthy. So, I mean, we clearly have a national challenge here in terms of transitioning to a truly sustainable and fair economy in a solidary perspective on a global scale. And then I just want to say, very last, I don't have the answer to your question about how to reduce population and keep welfare up, although we might be willing to lower welfare a little bit if welfare is material wealth. But I think it's a really important question that we have to start to address, because it's not being addressed because we don't really talk about population decline in the West. We should discuss exactly how do we reduce population and make our systems, welfare systems, still function. And this not just make it a problem about poor women in Africa, which is like the general approach. Thank you.
But the answer, I mean, the answer to that question I didn't even answer, because it's so totally obvious. You know, we have in the country 5 million people that gets up in the morning, and many of them do work, and in the evening they go to bed, and we have produced a large number of goods and services. What you are saying is, how do we do this if how do we distribute the labor? You know, is the essential issue. How many of these people go and care for elderly, and how many of these go to kindergarten, and how many go to a factory? So it's that this is the deepest political issue. We're using a market system currently, which sends the labor where there is highest demand. In my society, we plan. You know, the health.
But this is based on the idea that we will have lots of old people who need care, and then everybody else.
If you do
this is the background of the question.
I am 77. You know, the fact that I am not in a nursing home is fairly indicative of the 77-year-old people at this point in time. We should have a pension age in this country, which is around my age. You know, I've only 15 more years to live. You know, so trying to solve this with a pension age which is made for mine workers in the 1960s, you know, is idiotic. Most people in the next 50 years will be much more like I when they're 77. So why should we be kept away from you know, influencing you and depressing you and, you know, trying to kick your ass to do something instead of speaking about idealistic solutions?
Thank you, Jørgen. I would like to give the word to Laila.
Maybe he should have had the last word.
You are the sane person here, you know. So
no, well, anyway, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for this amazing debate. So very, very quickly, just a few points. Obviously, China has done amazingly well in terms of really looking at basic, you know, well-being of certain issues. But I would say, you know, yes, it is important to talk about the other things too. The human rights of all these other matters do matter, the Uyghur, etc. Tiananmen Square 30 years on, you know, let's not forget all that. And I think, you know, in terms of democracy, yes, democracy is the solution, but there's so many democratic deficits in democratic countries. Look at what's going on in the US. There may be a civil war. Look, I live in the UK. The UK is sliding into authoritarianism. I grew up in India, greatest democracy. Look at what's going on. So I guess, you know, and the backlash against women's rights. So let's just be vigilant. Let's not be complacent, because I think they could come after us next. So I think that's really, really important. That elephant in the room in Norway, I hope you will address that, all of you. And I guess there is this complacency in Norway about the lifestyle, about, you know, how good we are. So I guess there's stuff to address there. And finally, you know, transformation and transformative change, it's a buzzword now. I've got 2 projects on it. One is a research project. I'm part of this IPIS assessment on transformative change as one of the lead authors. It's a buzzword, yes, there's always going to be trade-offs, and you know, we all want the structural change, but how do we achieve it? I mean, look at the trade-offs, look at who's paying the costs. And I guess it's all about also lifting these invisible, marginalized perspectives to the fore, getting them in these fora. And you know, let's not give up, because I know you don't get disillusioned. You have to carry on till you're 100 with your work, and the rest of us have to, because you know, every step matters. So there are the citizen assemblies, there are movements of the youth, transition movements, there are alternative issues, and there'll always be backlash. But I guess if you change 2 or 3 people every time, that's a good step. So let's just keep at it.
Thank you very much. I would like to close now by with a few acknowledgements. I would like to warmly thank the Norwegian University of Life Science and the Sustainability Arenas for providing funding for this type of events. I would also like to thank the Political Ecology Forum and the European and international societies for ecological economics that have been co-hosting this event. Litteraturhuset, and I would like to ask you for a very warm applause to our speakers today. Last but not least, I would like to give a very special thanks to Pauline Rutten, Administrative Coordinator of the Sustainability Arenas, and the person that has been doing a huge amount of work behind the screens to make this happen. So please, Pauline, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Erik. I think we cannot let this moment pass by and not forget to thank you, the initiator of this event, this wonderful panel discussion, the exchange of wonderful different thoughts as well. So thank you so much for all of your work. And please, everyone, also in this room being present, continue with this exchanging of thoughts.
Thank you. To the audience as well. Have a wonderful Friday, have a wonderful weekend. Jo, så klart.